Global Indian Network. Print, TV, events, podcasts. Find out more at globalindianseries.com.
Welcome back to the Global Indian Podcast, home to the greatest conversations and the official platform for people of Indian origin. Yes, let's face it, we are everywhere. Now, you know, every single week we plunge into the human experience behind our perceptions of identity, take a second look at the countries we now call home, and tackle the big conversations. This week we continue our live coverage across Uganda. Well, as live as it can be, it is a jet-lagged voice of mine just returned to my grey skies of London. But before we kick off today's episode, which is co-hosted with Narendh Ganesh, many of you know he's our correspondent in South Africa, I'd like to say a massive thank you to all our dear supporters and sponsors, many of which you hear from soon. If you too would also like to get involved in our 50 Shades of Brown story as well, it couldn't be easier. Come to the website. It's www.globalindianseries.com. I truly hope you enjoyed this remarkable conversation.
Hi, my name is Divya and I'm co-founder of the Global Indian Podcast. Before you get to today's show, I've got a quick favour to ask. If you've been enjoying our conversations, I'd love if you could take just 1 minute to leave us a review on the platform that you're listening to us on and share our work to friends and family. It helps us out a lot. Word of mouth is the primary way that we grow. Thanks for your continued support.
Hi, my name is Nestor Alfred, CEO of St. Lucia Citizenship by Investment. Think freedom. What comes to mind? Freedom to explore, to travel to any destination for work or play? Or is it freedom of expression? Being surrounded by the globally minded, those who care for society and environment. Every year, people from around the world apply for St. Lucian citizenship because they realize that real freedom is based on choice. Discover more about St. Lucian citizenship and how it's helping global Indians achieve more.
My name is Chitra Stern, and I am a proud Global Indian Ambassador and CEO of Martiniale Resorts and Martiniale Residences. We pride ourselves on the journeys that define a community, and our developments bring people together. Did you know that over 70,000 people just like us call Portugal home? The Global Indian journey has brought people together in a meaningful way, and on behalf of all of us at Martiniale, we want to thank you for joining us in these remarkable conversations. We look forward to seeing you here in Lisbon post-COVID. Have a great day.
And just move. Get up and just move. Get up and just move. Get up and just move.
People who have been following the show have recently seen that we've been taking a live journey right the way across Uganda at this really important time. Now, have just literally landed back in the UK, blessed with the 50 Shades of grey skies of England. And I thought, let's do this as live as possible. So I'm joined today by our Global Indian correspondent all the way in South Africa, Narendh Ganesh, who's not only been a fantastic speaker on the podcast, but has also done a lot of the write-ups that many people see online. Now, the reason why we want to take this particular conversation up is because of the discussion that Narendh and I had earlier on. So for the first time in a long time, the microphones are now reversed. The power is in Narendh's hands, and we're going to kick off on a very interesting conversation. So Narendh, why don't you introduce yourself back to the audience that you have helped co-create?
Thank you, Rajan. Well, I'd like to say hi to everyone who's going to watch the podcast. I am Narendh Ganesh, based in Durban, South Africa, and I've had the privilege of being introduced to you sometime last year, but it was, I think, fateful that we met because it has changed perspective, it has given me perspective, and it has allowed me to tell the world a little more about South Africa, especially the Indian community. And quite interestingly, when I heard that you just arrived back from Uganda, it piqued my interest because Uganda was quite a bit of an interest of mine, you know, over the period of time, noting that there was a background of Indian or Asian involvement, and there was repercussions for their migration to the African continent. But to start off, I would like to ask, your conversation with the current president of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, how did that go?
Do you know what? I think before we kick off on that, there's something that you touched on there. Uganda for all of us was this mystical beast, wasn't it? It's the Freddy Kruegers of our time, because it's the first time for all of us that you had somebody that stood out openly and saying, as Indians, we do not want you here. And it's almost this redefining period for a lot of people to say, this is what should be done for some, the far right wings of different countries, to say we need to have protectionism. And for others, it was a wake-up call to say, well, what does nationality look like beyond the skin color? So yeah, with the interview, so I was over there for around about 2.5 weeks. We did interviews with the president and President Museveni through to all the big Indian families. I have to say, the head of state for Uganda, despite what is seen on TV, is one of the most charming, intellectually sharp individuals that you come across. And the conversation we had a look at 3 key areas. One was having a look at, well, what is national identity then in a country like Uganda that has this perception across the globe, especially for some of the people that are in South Africa that are looking as a poster child for Pan-Africanism through the rise of Idi Amin. So we spoke about that. We also spoke about the idea of national prosperity. How do you start building national prosperity in countries such as Uganda, who's only returned to their economic output of 1997 levels only a couple of years back? And then we also spoke about the big conversation, which is Pan-Africanism. What does it mean to him? A guy who some people look at as a poster child, and a country who people look at Idi Amin as a poster child for Pan-Africanism. So it's 2 very different takes, and it was a remarkable conversation. And it challenges the status quo in so many different ways. And it makes you rethink of how the world should kind of look at this guy, because it's not, although in the interview he's got his army uniform, but you realize that the military style that he talks about isn't just in arms, but it's in mindset, to say that we need to protect ourselves from the ails that are coming from outside the borders. And we need unity, and we need to be coming together. Something that the world doesn't really talk about that much, and bearing in mind, this is a country that accepted 1.4 million refugees, and they've been brought into Uganda right the way across from Africa. And when I met with some of the NGO workers, what they were surprised was saying the way in which local communities have taken these refugees on, and they belong now to Uganda. It's not a separate refugee camp where people say, no, you don't belong here. There's something within the very psyche of the makeup of the country that have said, you're from Africa, you're within Africa, you're here, regardless of the tonality of your skin color, we're all brothers and sisters. There's a very powerful thing that the world can learn from that,
Yeah. Look, 1972, I think, was the expulsion of the Asians from Uganda. And obviously, Idi Amin at that time, for whatever reasons, and this was our prelim discussion that I am still figuring out because there hasn't been anything concrete about it, was the exact reason for the expulsion of the Asian community from Uganda. Did the president give you any idea of what he knew? Because he succeeded Idi Amin, prior to Idi Amin taking over by force from Milton Obote. What were the so-called specific reasons for the expulsion?
I think, so there's no definitive answer because it's coming from multiple different sources. But what he mentioned in the interview was interesting because he said Idi Amin did not represent Uganda. He forcefully put himself there, and he was also there by the British. So this wasn't a Ugandan that won local support or public opinion. This is a guy who forcefully put himself there, who wasn't educated, who then said, now I am the president of this country. Is that something for the world to recognize? He wasn't the Ugandan aspiring politician that people loved. What Idi Amin saw was this idea of inequality through business, but what he didn't realize is that the Indian community that was there, they weren't just subjects to the British. These were people who built up businesses and companies because they realized that there was an opportunity. And this may sound controversial, but what he was trying to practice, Idi Amin, was a form of protectionism. He said, if you're investors, you come in, but there has to be areas for opportunity for the local Ugandan population really for him. Now, this is what people don't realize in this era of color politics. Any individual that was becoming successful that he saw as a challenge to him, regardless if they're Asian or indigenous African, he would get rid of. So even after Indians were taken out, for the economic side, and I'll run you through why that happened, even local business leaders who were indigenous Ugandans who were making wealth were either killed or their businesses were taken off them. Now, if that sinks into people, they realize that his form of economic warfare wasn't about protectionism of the economy, but it's really about protectionism of himself. Now, the reason why the Indians were kicked out, there's a couple of stories there. One is a dream amongst dreams where God spoke to him and only him and said, you must now rid these lands of Indians because they are the colonials. The other story behind it is that he fell in love with one of the members of a very prominent Indian family who I actually met with. And that woman did not reciprocate his love. And therefore, out of rage, he kicked everybody out. But there's another story that people don't talk about, is that he went over to another neighboring country and he asked for their support. And what they said is, if you want to get the British backs up because they're not giving you arms and they're not doing what you want them to do, why do you kick out the people that brought in? And the people that brought in happen to be the Indians. So there's also another ruse to kind of wind up the British to say, if you don't do what I want you to do, this is what I'm going to do in return. Knowing full well that India wouldn't take the people on because they're no longer Indian nationals, and knowing what impact it would have on Britain, because bearing in mind, Britain didn't take the Indians on immediately. They had to go back and forth. It was only then, I think it was Sir Edward Heath turned around and said, okay, look, they need to come back in. They were our responsibility. Canada took them in. Netherlands took them in. Britain grudgingly took them in. But obviously, we know the rest is history from there.
Yeah, and just following up on the aspect that you mentioned about Idi Amin's idea of protectionism. If I recall, Milton Obote's government had pursued a policy of Africanization at the time, which included policies that were targeted at Ugandan Asians. I think there was a committee called the Africanization in Commerce and Industry, for example, and this had made far-reaching Indophobic proposals in the system of work permits for the Asians. But am I correct in saying that the initial aspect of bringing Asians into Uganda was to work on the railway line?
Absolutely. So that's what they brought in by the British, because the British knew that they already had experience of dealing with Indians in India. And so therefore, it was actually the big Punjabi community that came over to build the railway line. So those were the loony railway workers. Everybody knows the story about the lions that became, killers of humans, claws bigger than heads type of thing, right? But the Indians were brought in for that. But then you had another movement of Indians, which were from Gujarat, that saw the trading opportunities, same way in the Middle East. So when the British went to the Middle East, a lot of Indians went over with them because they realized that they could do trade at the same time. And it's profitable for them because they're selling directly to the British. So that's where the Indian other communities started to come through. And that's where we saw the plethora of businesses that started to set up. They weren't brought in to be the middle ground, despite what a lot of people want to think. The reality is common sense is everything but common. They were brought over and the British liked to work with them because they had a commonality in language. The Indian community at that moment in time realized how the British people did business. So therefore they knew how to have that social lubricant of transactions just to make sure that things went fairly. And that was all it was. It was a lucky chance for some traders to see what if. From there, they grew.
The one thing that concerned me about that aspect as well was the Indian government's response. I recall that the Indian government at the time warned Amin of the consequences of what he was planning to do. But the Amin government or regime just ignored the ultimatum. Can you perhaps shed light as to what you learned?
There's so much more to that, Narendh, because when Amin came into power, there's still 40 families that chose to stay in Uganda. So they had a choice. You either take a Ugandan passport, you take a British passport, first choice. So a lot of people took a Ugandan passport. Some took the British, they left. Those who took the Ugandan passports were people like the Madhvani family, right? So I met with Ganesh Madhvani, one of the sons there. And he goes, after a while then, they started to realize that taking the passport wasn't enough. It really came down to the texture, the color of your skin, because even then they were kicked out. However, there were still some 40 families that remained in there. And Idi Amin had one of the guys, Indian guys, he arrested some to make a statement to everybody saying, if you don't leave, this is what happens to you. But even then, when that person was brought out of prison, one of the guys was made an ambassador to India, an Indian guy. So this Sikh gentleman was made an ambassador to India on behalf of Idi Amin's government. And he goes over to India and he strikes a deal according to what I heard. And the Indian government provides trucks to Idi Amin. So is not as clear cut as most people think, because even though the Indian government may have made this statement saying, don't do this, they're still willing to do trade with them.
Yeah.
And what it does, it actually puts in perspective that, do governments look at you through your skin color to say, you are our diaspora and we believe in you and we'll protect your rights? Or is it the case that once you leave and you no longer have a passport, you're no longer our obligation? So therefore we can utilize it for trading purposes whenever it's in our convenience. And when it's an inconvenience, we can then safely say we're no longer involved. A classic example would be that of South Africa last year, you know? So
Yeah.
that's a really interesting perspective. And the reason why the Indian government also, I think, didn't step forward in that was because they said, well, you're no longer a national. And then how can a government then say, well, I will become your protectorate purely down to where your ancestral grounds are? And that's what makes it really interesting. Either shows a lot more light on the politics of the day in India, or it may show the light on how politics has changed generationally to say, well, what now classes somebody as Indian? Is it a passport holder? Is it origin? Or is it just a social lubricant to see how we can do trade and investments from?
Yeah. You know, Yoweri Museveni was among the first foreign African leaders to address the South African Parliament post-apartheid, the first democratic government. And if I am to understand, he has brokered very close relationships with the Gujarati community in Uganda, whom I believe that he believes have made a significant contribution to Uganda.
Yeah, it's more than that though. It's the whole community. He's dealing with the Ismaili community. The Aga Khan's been back and forth. He's dealt with the Sikh community, Punjabi community. What strikes me about this guy, and hopefully you'll see more once we can get the support from the government there, is that it's not what the international media has pushed out. This is a guy who 25 years ago, without having to, turn around to the Indian community and say, look, come back home. This is your home. You're Ugandan. He didn't say you're Asian Ugandan. He didn't say that we're Black Ugandans. He goes, you are Ugandan. Come back home. So in this area where you have a plethora of events taking place across the UK, the US, Canada, where everyone is almost saying in a way, we got exploded 50 years ago and look how well we've done since, and a pat on their back. They're also forgetting to realize that when they were kicked out, close to about 800,000 Ugandans were murdered as well. So they're left with their lives. They lost their businesses, but they're left with their lives. President Museveni is the guy that turned around and goes, here's your houses. Here are your businesses. Come back home. Your businesses are safe. If you can showcase that this was your business beforehand, it will be returned to you. Bearing in mind, some organizations, some people already got reparations for the loss of businesses. I think in some cases, governments gave them money, through the high commissions. So some of these families did come back because of the actual call to action from the head of state. Narendh, what other head of state has ever done that before?
Yeah, no, that's true.
And so we should be really I was going to say, we should be really celebrating the fact that 25 years on, that this guy took a decision that would not have been popular for those who kind of supported the Idi Amin philosophy to say, you are Ugandan and Ugandan is not a skin color. This is an era of Pan-Africanism where some people are looking at Pan-Africanism through the eyes of skin texture and not about the birthright of the people who are born in those lands. It's a far cry, Yeah.
To this day, according to the president, how much of contribution have the Indian community of Uganda made to the economy of the country, or how have they assisted in development and progression of the economy?
If we move up, so we'll use the word Indian, we'll use the word Ugandan Asians.
Right.
I'm precising that word because they are Ugandans.
Yeah.
So the Ugandan Asian community are the biggest taxpayers in the country. So just to put in perspective, they make up 0.01%, right, of the population. They contribute towards tax receipts anywhere between 60 to 80% of the tax revenue that the government collects. That is huge. So basically, the economic revival came from a lot of these guys who had that opportunity to do so. But there's more to the story, right? It's not down to just business savviness alone. And we have to be very honest with that. It's also the fact that a lot of the Asian community had the opportunity to borrow money cheaper compared to many that were indigenous. Because you had the Asian community that had access to banks in the UK, through families that were here, they could take loans in the UK at the degree, I'm making up the numbers here, of 4% interest.
Right.
Whereas if they took the same amount of money in Uganda, it will cost them 18 to 20% interest rates. So automatically they have the opportunity to borrow money cheaply and to invest it wisely in Uganda to build up jobs, but also to build up their businesses. Many of the people didn't have that opportunity. So in reverse, because of Idi Amin's actions, that he pushed people out, those same families, when they found themselves at home in like the UK or in Canada, they were able to then have local bank accounts. And when they realized that they had opportunities back home, they did the natural thing. Economics spoke. They took out loans, and therefore they were able to build up quicker businesses compared to some of the international companies that came in. So that's an interesting perspective that people forget. Again, at a time where it's 50 years of the Asian expulsion, where people will be, unfortunately, across the world saying, this is bad, this is terrible, this is painful. What they fail to realize is 50 years on, where the country's now begun. Don't get me wrong, it's not all happy clappy. It's not kumbaya. It's not let's jump around the fire. There's still some ailing issues there. But to do that within the space of 30 years, there's something extraordinary there that should really be celebrated, because it's a celebration of humanity.
Yeah. Most of the return of the Ugandan Asians were from Britain, who went to Britain. But you mentioned the Aga Khan, the Imam of the Nizari Ismailis. Now, if I recall reading many, many moons ago, he had contacted Pierre Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister at the time, and they accepted the expelled citizens from Uganda. Have they returned back to Uganda?
There's a huge Ismaili community. In fact, what's interesting about the Aga Khan, His Excellency there, is that when he went to Canada, he didn't fight for just the Ismaili community. He actually said, allow refugees to come in. That's interesting, because that means it was done without fear or favor. When you go back into Uganda, you have like a large Ismaili community. I met with the ambassador there. What the hotel that I was staying at, the Fairway Hotel, it was actually opened up by the Aga Khan and the Pope. So it's absolutely remarkable. So this community there have done a lot. And as a community, and under the Aga Khan's other angles, you got banks that are there under the Aga Khan's foundations. You got insurance companies, the biggest hotels there. In fact, one of the hotels that was built on Idi Amin's killing ground is now there because of the Aga Khans. So it's really, really interesting, the connection there. But yeah, they returned and they've done incredibly well. The Punjabi community, some of them stayed, some of them returned back. They've done incredibly well. The Gujarati community, they've done incredibly well. Some stayed, some left. In fact, you have a new modern movement of Indians that have come in since the 90s that came in straight from India, who weren't exploded, and they came over because of trading opportunities. I sat down with the High Commissioner there, and he's saying that, unfortunately, there's not as much trade as could be done, because I think there's a big fear still of Uganda. And the problem is, if you don't challenge that fear will always remain. It affects your friendships, it affects your trading opportunities, it affects your diplomacy. But there is this new wave of Indians coming in. I have a concern about some of this new wave of Indians that are coming in, because I think we've seen it everywhere. We've heard the stories of the Gupta brothers, for example, in South Africa. And so I think that what you can see happening in Uganda is two forms of the Indian community. You have a Ugandan Asian and you have an Asian in Uganda. Two very different types of people. One, they call it home. This is them. Second, they come over for a short while, make the money, and they leave. And unfortunately, when you have that mindset, people will be prepared to cut some corners rather than the other ones because they call it home.
Yeah, because there's a very strong parallel between Uganda and Zimbabwe. When the late President Mugabe expelled white farmers from Zimbabwe, believing that they control too much of the land and the economy, etc. Yet upon his demise, the current president Ngwangwa has invited the farmers to come back and restore their farms and stuff. So obviously, when you have a dictatorial leadership, which, you know, in most countries where there were such leadership, you will find that whatever policies and enactments that they performed at the time that they took power was reversed by those who see the picture, the bigger picture, the greater good. And I think for that reason, you know, probably Museveni has done the right thing. As much as I've told you previously, I always believe a leader should have at least a maximum of 2 terms. But sometimes, who takes over? What kind of leadership do you get if the man is doing good? How much more do you want someone else to come and do? So it's a very interesting aspect, and Uganda has been, because of Idi Amin, you know, the nightmare of Africa at some point, especially 50 years ago, when all this purging, this question importantly, the current Asian Ugandans or Ugandan Asians would be considered natives of the country that they were born there.
That's interesting. That's interesting.
Sorry,
because I think that's interesting because they are now looking for tribal status. So the Ugandan Asian community have said, look, we want to be recognized as a tribe because we're now 40,000 plus in the country. He goes, there's tribes here that only have 3,000, 4,000 people. He goes, and the reason why they want tribal status, I think, is much more than just a social custodianship. I think it's also legally as well to say we are Ugandan. What do you do then? Because when all of a sudden you say, well, the Indian tribe of Uganda, how does that translate now to the world of modern day politics where you have people that are from Punjab prior to partition? Do they say, well, we are now Pakistani Ugandans? How does it work then for different communities? Do they say, well, we are the Lahana Ugandans and you guys are the Punjab? And so do we start going down that route of 50 Shades of Brown segmentation? Or do we see people unitedly saying, actually, we can come under one banner because that's where India was prior to partition? Narendh, as always, you are incredibly well read because you know the histories of the regions of Africa. And also you've been involved politically as well. So you also get those sensitivities. Coming back to that point, because you're not the first one and you'll never be the last one to talk about it, that you've got a head of state that's been in there for multiple decades. There's a lot more that we'll talk about, obviously, on the documentary that showcases the other narrative to this, but there's not many people in Uganda that remember what happened 50 years ago. You know, you got a very young population. This is a guy who lost family members under Idi Amin. This is a guy who was a refugee himself because he had to take refuge in the local countries there. And that's where he built up the resistance. This is also a guy who is taking in generations now of refugees. This is a guy who has fought for peace right across the region. This is a gentleman who's incredibly well learned, and he's gone out there to actually say we need to be united. Where the disparity is, I think, is that the youth of Uganda do not realize what the events were in the past. And I can't blame them because you only think about your own generation. But if you see where the country was and where it is now, it is literally night and day. What he has done in terms of the economic rebuild over the course of 30 years is unprecedented. You know, you got an economy, and yes, many can argue, if the base rate of success was here, anything that goes above that is a huge success. So when people say we've seen an increase of 25% in terms of our GDP, well, it's potato and potato representation. But the question remains, if he wasn't there, is there anybody else that have the intellectual, emotional, as well as experience capacity to lead the country to where it's head to? It's very easy for the UK and the US to say, well, you can only serve 2 terms. That's fine when you've already got the infrastructure in place that has been built up for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. But when you got a country that is small and delicate like Uganda, you need somebody that can come in, that can actually set the right type of tonality. I'm not saying that I'm an advocate, or neither I'm saying I'm against. I'm just saying from an impartial viewpoint, this is a guy that actually did something. And also for the Asian community this year, it's 50 years since. But everyone's just celebrating 50 years since they got expulsion from Uganda. That in itself puts a bane of existence, because then no one's thinking about those Ugandan families who died in the country. No one's thinking about, well, what happened next over identity? And no one's thinking actually that this guy, he actively went out there to say, come back home. He wasn't inviting investors. He wasn't saying, take your newfound money and invest it back into Uganda. He went out there to say, come back to your home. This is your home. And we've got your properties. If you want your properties back, you will be provided them back, because you're Ugandan. You're not Asian first, you're Ugandan first. When we did the interview, he spoke fondly about these 4 families that he grew up with, Ugandan Asians. And he was laughing with me. That's with the clip that you saw where he gave me the Africanized version of my name, because it's tongue in cheek. He goes, these people were instrumental to the communities. People saw them as Ugandan. They weren't Asian. And when you learn about his background and how he got into politics and how farming changed his lifestyle, then you realize why he thinks the way he thinks. It's something that's in the documentary, because that gives you an understanding of what his psyche is like. When the younger people of Uganda saw the clip of the naming ceremony, they were in disbelief. They said, I can't believe how chilled out this guy is. Because the media want to showcase this guy who's a firm stance. He's got no personality. He's holding onto the country with the clasp of his hand to say, I shall not let go. But what you really find is this very charming guy who can sit there and have a joke with you, have a laugh with you, yet discuss the most pertinent issues. But don't get me wrong, Narendh, I'm not there waving the flag of any political party. I'm just saying from my perspective, meeting with them. And when you meet with some of the families there, when they talk, Narendh, I've never seen it before. There's a couple of families. There's one, Pradeep Gadia, they own a really big firm there. The guy is a nationalist, Asian guy. He's a nationalist. He believes in Uganda. He believes in the president's vision. And he was nearly in tears when he was talking about it, because he said, Rajan, people do not understand what it was like under Idi Amin and the differences made for the average Ugandan. And then I met with the Mehta family, who are really well known. And the wife, Mrs. Mehta, she was practically nearly in tears, because she said, Uganda's my home. She goes, I have no bars on my home. She goes, when I came back, everything was there. In fact, the people that were working the factory, they had a celebration, because they said, now prosperity's come back. Now you got Mr. Mehta. She built a statue of Mother Mary in the garden for everyone to be able to worship. And she brought in this Italian architect. The mindset that those families have over Uganda is so different. And even the team that I was with, they were shocked, because they see themselves as Ugandan first. You got this guy, Sudhir Vaparalia, who's supporting us over there. And we went to a restaurant, a local Ugandan restaurant, eating. And he's at home. The problem is with our community, and the problem is within the communities there, is that we fail to realize that to belong to a nation is much more than just the arbitrary fact of your skin color.
Exactly.
And politicians need to learn that. But as a community, we also need to learn that. This year marks 50 years, but we can't celebrate 50 years of when the Asians got exploded. We need to be also thinking 50 years ago, we saw the dramatic change to what identity was. We saw the same guy that the likes of Julius Malema will hold up and say he's an Africanized person, people like Idi Amin. He killed over 500,000 Ugandans, murdered them. And when the Obote came in, another 300, 400,000 people were murdered because of this tribal conflict. When Museveni came in, he ended this. Imagine what that means for the older generation of Ugandans when they realize this is a guy who didn't take retribution. He didn't do this whole tit for tat thing. He said, let's unite and let's go forward. No other leader's done that. But the Uganda story is so much deeper. There's so much that's there. But there's so much that the world can learn from, No,
I will concede that the very first time I witnessed Museveni speak was obviously a televised parliament talk in the South African parliament. And, they say first impressions last. I found him to be extremely brilliant, the unusual African leader.
Yeah.
because the way he spoke, the content of his speech reverberated of what Africa should be like. And he warned South Africa. But as the years went by, obviously, each election, which I followed in many ways, and like in every country, you will have the opposition who will point fingers at rigging the elections to get in and stuff, which is the norm in politics. But be that as it may, and just for my concluding part, the Indian community, and I don't use the word Asian, I use the Indian community in the diaspora, due to their migration worldwide and in the entire diaspora, they've made contributions in virtually every field of human endeavor. And, whether it's agriculture, business, commerce, medicine, education. And the impressive part about it is that they did it not by handouts. They did it by perseverance, hard work, and diligence. And we should take pride in the fact that it would be very difficult when you are being led back to the killing fields. But like you said, Museveni had changed the whole narrative. I mean, it would have been unimaginable to think, had Idi Amin continued his reign, what would have happened to the country.
Imagine what it would have meant for the world, right? And you're absolutely right. Yeah. One thing that has happened with our community, we have worked in countries without fear or favor. We've supported champions of change. Look at yourself, Narendh. You're in South Africa. You galvanized people together under the most harshest conditions, where you had the whole Phoenix disaster. And what you turned around with, I remember we were both on the same platform. You said, this is a travesty, not just for the Indian community, but for South Africa. Because we are South Africans, we have to come together as humans. One thing that you see with the story of Uganda, especially from that perspective, so the Asian or the Indian community that's there, is that there are some who have changed the very fabric of what Ugandanness represents for the better. Some of these guys are now parliamentarians. You've had others who have been active ministers there. These are stories that people don't tell you. Still, they look at Uganda through the eyes of Freddy Krueger. It's a dark enemy of the world. It's where racialization and discrimination existed, and somehow they pushed it across the world like a spider web. We've heard murmurs of this in the Caribbean. I know we both know what we're discussing here. Murmurs of that. You've heard murmurs of this in South Africa, all the way through to Fiji, but they couldn't be more wrong. Yes. Idi Amin did not represent Africa. Idi Amin did not represent, if one people want to do it, the black ethnicity. Idi Amin represented himself. He represented the very worst of that notion that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolute. That's what he represented.
He was a narcissistic egotist, So
there's something that the president said, Museveni, in the interview. He goes, he was a chauvinist. He also used the word idiot a few times. He also mentioned about Julius Malema. He goes, it's chauvinism. But chauvinism isn't just within Africa. We've seen it right the way across the world. He also mentioned a passing remark that I thought was very expertly done. And he said that any community that is lucky enough to have people that are a minority group, they should count themselves lucky. They shouldn't chase them out, because those communities there also add to the flavor of what that nationalism is. Exactly. And when you sink that in, and it's a very true statement, it changed the fabric of how we look at the world. Because what he sees as Pan-Africanism is saying, it's not about skin color. It can't be. That's as ludicrous. And he goes, it's not about tribes. It's about saying, if you're within the continent, we need each other to trade. You may have a product that I need. I may have a product that you need. If people can then do trade and they can earn money, because you alleviate a lot of the problems immediately, because nobody cares about skin color then. As long as everybody has the opportunity to grow. Then I think you are a case example of that. The work that you have done, even in the recent elections there, you did something that no other Indian would have done. It would have been very easy for you to turn around and use pigmentation for your whole campaign, but you didn't. Exactly. You didn't. So for me, you represent the very best of what Africa has as well, because you chose to look at things through the eyes of humanism rather than just an object form of skin color. And we know enough politicians that are very good at doing that, because it shows that they got no economic policies. They got no social construct. There's no custodianism over the people of the lands. All it is ego, chauvinism to get themselves elected. That's what the
Yeah.
problems are, you know. So for me, I
No,
think
it's as simple as this. If you look at your fellow human being in difference, you darken the similarities that you have with them.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
you know, that's how the world should look. You know, we can't look at people with rose-tinted glasses with a prejudice. You got to look at them blindly and openly as the fellow human being. So,
You know what?
but this was an interesting.
Shakespeare's got nothing on you, Naren. Nothing on you, I'm telling you, you know?
No, this was an absolutely nice conversation, but like you said, there's so much more. And I think we need to pursue this because I think the younger generation need to understand perspective. Sometimes it's important to know where you're coming from to where you are going to. We are in the present, but the past has been a route carved for the future. And I think it's important, you know, these kind of podcasts continue and we should get a diverse community or diverse panel of people to contribute. It will, especially the young ones, to see how they see, and you know, to get a young Ugandan to probably do a podcast with you.
I think that then you have now planted the seed, so we're going to have to execute that. So that is done. It's true what you say. It's the problem with a single narrative is that it's subject to stereotype. Now, if those stereotypes aren't challenged, they become the only evidence that future generations can hold on to.
Yes.
And that's the thing, what we've done, you know, the power is not telling the story. The power is telling the story in the definitive message without fear or favor. And I think that's what we're doing with Uganda. You know, that's why, you know, the documentary that we're producing is so important, because for the first time in history for Uganda, people are accurately able to say, this is what identity means in the country, which then opens it up for trade. It opens up for the opportunities that come as a derivative of that. But the story of Uganda is not Idi Amin. The story of Uganda is not the Asian expulsion. The story of Uganda is literally 50 years on. What can the world learn from this small country who saw death, that saw destruction, that saw divisiveness, and somehow, despite the challenges, found its own niche in the globe? I think the story of Uganda is now just starting off, in all honesty. But Narendh, thank you always for your support. Thank you for putting me on the mark this time. And I look forward to doing the panel discussion now that you have earnestly put forward.
Yeah. No, thank you kindly for inviting me as well.
Thank you.
You have a good one.
You too. What a remarkable conversation. I'm sure you agree. We will continue our coverage on this idea of Ugandanness next week for our final installment, where we bring together some of the conversations we've had there, including that of the head of state, His Excellency President Museveni, through to some of the families that I had the pleasure of sitting down with. If you'd like to find out more about our episode on Ugandanness and the docuseries that we'll be launching, drop me an email or find me on social media. Until next week, I hope all remains well.